Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar series run by WHO, EPI-WIN team, UNICEF and Religions for Peace. We're delighted to have you with us this afternoon. Thank you for joining. This is the third webinar in a series, and we give apologies from Sarah Hess, who's our team leader in WHO, who's got a conflict this afternoon. My name is Sally Smith, and I'm a consultant supporting her on the faith work. We're also joined by Alex McFedrin, who's another team member who's supporting us with the logistics today. So we would like to welcome all of you to this webinar. It's titled Trusted Voices, Who, Why and How to Communicate About COVID-19 Vaccines. And this webinar, as I mentioned, is part of a series. It's the third of the series. And this is a technical briefing, partly in response to a number of requests from our faith colleagues to have some updates around this communication. We've had a couple of webinars in the last month where some of our faith partners have presented their work. That will not happen today, but we do encourage you to go and look at the website, the YouTube site, where you'll find some of these previous webinars, and there will be, again, faith inclusion in the future. So again, we'd encourage you to follow the series. The webinar will be recorded, and that's why, so that it can go on the website and people who've not been able to make it today can join us. And the webinar will be translated into French. For those of you who would like French, if you look towards the bottom of your screen, you'll find an interpretation icon at the bottom. You can click on that and you can find the French interpretation there. If you need help, please put a message in the chat box and one of us can guide you. And we will put questions and answers, please, in the chat box for the end of the session. There's a couple of us who will be reading those and fielding those and feeding them back to our presenters. I think that's all the nuts and bolts. So I will now hand over to my colleague from UNICEF, B, who will take the moderation forward. Thank you very much, B.
Thank you, Sally. And good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. It's such a pleasure to be a part of this series. Welcome to this conversation. As Sally has said, this is not the first one. It's part of a broader series that we look at faith, engagement, communications, and UNICEF are very proud to be partnering with WHO and RFP and a lot of our other partners as we continue this conversation. As Sally mentioned, today is a technical briefing from our colleagues at WHO. But, the reason why we're doing the technical briefing is because after listening to so many of our faith colleagues on the best practices that they've done and the challenges that they faced, more than ever, the importance of trust when it comes to communication is so critical. And, I think, part of the trust is obviously having that the sense of information, but sharing that. So for us, the fact that faith leaders are on board, they are such a trusted member of this community as we do our work around COVID. It's so crucial. And, we really want to acknowledge that this is not the first time that the UN or other organizations have worked with faith-based partners to build trust. It's been done in the past. It's been done when we looked at polio vaccinations. It's been done when we looked at countering gender-based violence. So there are so many aspects. But during COVID, the plethora and the various tiers where we need to work together with religious leaders, because the work is so centered on faith, is so important. So at the start of the pandemic, we looked at working with them to talk about, how to keep a safe distance, how to avoid mass gatherings. And, it helped that faith leaders were standing along with us to talk about what were safe practices, how to keep safe, how to keep calm. As we go forward, understanding how to build trust is not just important when it comes to only vaccine hesitation or only creation for vaccine demand, for the uptake of vaccines, but it goes into so many other aspects. The reopening of schools, Are teachers trusting the vaccines? Can we speak to community members when it comes to, like, can we work with faith leaders who are so critical in the community to explain why vaccinations are so important? This goes towards looking at positive parenting, at mental health. There's such a huge plethora of results that are centered on trust, that are centered on the sense of working together, and our faith-based partners are absolutely critical in that. So we're just so proud to have all of you on board. We really hope that this is a journey that you continue to take part with us. And yes, just thank you very much for your time. And with that, I will hand over to my colleague, Ben from Religions for Peace.
Thank you, B. Greetings to everyone. My name is Ben Meus, and on behalf of Religions for Peace, I joined WHO and UNICEF in welcoming everyone in this third series of the webinars. As you know or may not know, Religions for Peace is a global multi-religious movement with 90 national and 6 regional interreligious councils, Women of Faith and Youth Network, globally, regionally, and at the national levels. When the pandemic struck, Religions for Peace set up a multi-religious humanitarian fund to support multi-religious collaboration efforts in responding to COVID-19 across the globe. With that, we've been able to provide funds to implement over 20 projects in Africa, Asia, Europe, the Middle East, Latin America, and the Caribbean region. And religious leaders, institutions, faith-based organizations, as we know and see, have always been in the front line responding to crises, challenges. We've witnessed how they play a critical role in addressing health issues. Historically, we've seen that with HIV, AIDS, Ebola, and now we see it also with COVID-19. They're frequently a trusted entity within their community and hold an extraordinary moral authority, credibility within their communities and their followers. So through that, religious leaders influence thinking, attitudes, and they change behaviors. So it's incredibly important, and religious leaders play an incredibly important role in disseminating information, raising awareness among communities because of that unparalleled reach also they have through billions of followers across the globe. Faith leaders have already joined myriad efforts to help promote, maintain public health measures, and provide also accurate information on vaccines. So rumors, myths, miscommunication that can lead people to receive the wrong information about vaccines. Religious leaders and institutions can address this and ensure that their followers have the right information to overcome vaccine hesitancy, which Religions for Peace is also committed to addressing alongside the WHO and UNICEF, but also to equip the people to hold relevant authorities accountable. And therefore, it's important that religious actors have the right evidence-based information. And we sincerely hope that today's webinar will help in this. But before we start, I would like to invite a small moment of silence for all those who have passed away due to COVID-19 and all those who continue to suffer from its consequences. Yeah. So with that, maybe one moment of silence, 1 minute. Thank you very much. And with that, I will I'll pass the word to Mindy or Linda and Leilia. Thank you.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon, good evening. My name is Melinda Frost, and I'm the translate science team lead for the WHO COVID-19 response. So thank you for taking the time today to be with us. I see this as such a really valued friendship and partnership between our organizations and you. You're on the ground, you see what's happening in people's lives. I'm sure you took that minute and you could think about individuals that you've known in your community that have really suffered or lost their lives. And that closeness, that reality check for what we're doing is really important to us. So we really strongly value the work that you're doing, and I'm really, thrilled that we can be working together. I think my colleague Alex may be sharing some slides so we can get going with a bit of a conversation so we can share our background and our experience that may be relevant to the work that you're doing. So as just a bit of background while the slides are coming up, I've worked in this area for almost 20 years, working on the ground with countries on how to prepare for such an event like COVID. We primarily have been working around pandemic influenza, thinking that would be the next pandemic. So part of what we talked about with the national level responders was this need to really reach out through trusted information sources and information links to communities, and knowing full well that those are not the things that are going to be established during an emergency. Those are the things that have to be established beforehand. So I think that's, just a test how important it is around the work that you're doing, because you have colleagues, you have communities already set, and they trust the work that you're doing. So that's exactly what we had talked to national level responders about being able to do, is to link with organizations like you for the next emergency. Okay, let's see if we have these things. Great. Okay, good. You can. I'll be presenting today with my teammate, Leilia Dore, who's now managing our risk communications work for WHO headquarters around the COVID-19 vaccine. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Thanks. So this section, I'm just going to talk a little bit more about how important trust is and why they're more important than ever now during the crises of COVID-19. Next slide. So this is kind of what we know about the COVID-19 vaccine right now. There never has been, but there's definitely not now a one size fits all. I can't give you a 2-sentence description about what's happening in the world, because it's all becoming very, very nuanced and very centered around different cultures, the context in countries and communities. It's all very, very different. So it makes it difficult for us at the global level to really be able to pinpoint our communications. All the more reason it's so important that you are outfitted with the right scientific information to share with your counterparts. So what we do know is that, of course, like I said, the landscape is quite varied and very dynamic. Attitudes are evolving in different directions. We're seeing substantial variation across demographics and at subnational levels, meaning in some cases, the trust in vaccine is improving. People want the vaccine. In other cases, it's not, depending on your age group and your location. And then there's the whole context of whether or not there is even vaccine. So there could be high demand, but no vaccine available in a particular country. Hesitancy is a hurdle, and I'll go a little bit more into depth about what that is. And just to say that many times at this point of a response, I'll say that our epidemiologic counterparts and colleagues say, okay, we just need to communicate more about this particular issue. But I can tell you that communication alone is not going to make the difference that we need right now in terms of trust in vaccine. Trust in government is also translating into trust in vaccine. So in areas and countries where there's a lack of trust in leadership, we're seeing that play over into the lack of trust of vaccine. And then we also know that lack of transparency feeds into this feeling of mistrust. So when there's not a lot of information or there's no misinformation, people are not trusting their government, and then that trickles over into not trusting the vaccine rollout in the country. So, so we know that very targeted interventions are really needed, again, among subnational groups. So that makes it even more nuanced and even more difficult. And these issues that we're seeing, it's for COVID-19 right now, but these are the types of issues we would imagine and could happen in any vaccine rollout. Next slide, please. So here's kind of what we know about trust. This is what we've known about trust in every emergency. It's key. It is the cornerstone from which we try to achieve. That's the goal of all of our communications and our actions. What we know is that it cannot be easily gained during an emergency, but it can be easily lost. So we're really returning to sources of information and engagement that people have already known, already trusted, and already used for information. So we know that during an emergency, people are not going to look at too many different communications channels. They'll probably revert back to the ones they've used most often because those are considered to be the most trusted. So we often say, when it comes to ministries of health and so on, if people were not looking at your website before, or they're not on Twitter or whatever, they're not going to look at it now. So we really need to kind of go back to communications where we know people are looking, communication opportunities. And then we also know that the closer the threat comes to an individual's world, the more localized the sources of information they're going to look. So if you have arises in cases of COVID-19 in your communities, they will likely turn to you as a close source of information. And then what we always try to achieve is consistency and then provision of updated information and regular intervals in places where we know people are apt to look. Okay, next slide. It's important to understand the dynamics around vaccine hesitancy and demand. It's a sort of a scale. It's not one size fits all. Again, you can see there are many different reasons people may be hesitant, may be very valid. They just can't get access to the vaccine, or they just may have some really valid questions. So it's not a clear, clean yes or no. It might be that they need some questions answered. And so we see in the scale that you have many people who are fine. They will get the vaccine, they're accepting it, they could be even demanding it or advocating for it. And then you get this sort of graded area on the left-hand side under vaccine hesitant, people that aren't sure, they could be just rejecting, or they're an activist, they're anti-vaccine. It's these people that are kind of on the uptick that we're aiming to get. The people that are still kind of in that questioning mode, and those are the people that are really super important to communicate with. Often we're not going to change the mind of the activist. We can use or work with the individuals that are advocating for vaccine. They could be further voices among their communities and so on. It's this sort of tipping point, those people on the fence that are critically important to communicate with. Next slide, please. And just to say that loads of guidance, trust is always the focus of what we're trying to achieve. Next slide, please. And then these are the types of things when people are looking for trust. It's important. If people don't trust their source of information, if they don't trust the information coming to them, they're not likely to take the recommendations. And it's just going to further cause a situation where the issue may be difficult to mitigate. So individuals are looking at the communicators to them, and they're essentially, like, could be risk managers, essentially. Are they skilled enough to do the job? Do they know what they're doing? Are they going to protect my health? Are they acting in my best interest? Do they know me? Do they know what my world is like? Are they going to be making decisions that are going to affect my life in the right way? Do they understand my situation? Do they know that I have a job, or do they know I have children, or I'm trying to work from home, or I need to be able to work to afford food for my family? Do they understand that? If not, then their recommendations and what they're saying to me will just go beyond me, because they don't know the life I'm living. And then basically, are they telling the truth? And it's not just truth versus falsehood. It could be that people feel as though there's more information that risk managers or responders are omitting or just leaving out, and that could cause a loss of trust as well. But when people generally have feelings around, if they can answer yes to all of these cases, then that's where you've gained some trust. So just how people are viewing the trust issue when it comes to communications during emergencies. Next slide. And then there's the whole issue of managing misinformation. I think you've probably heard quite a bit about this throughout the COVID-19 response, because there's been a lot of misinformation, mostly spread online through social media. But the important point here is that it starts from somewhere, right? It didn't start online. It didn't start through social media. It started from a person telling another person, or a misunderstanding of misinformation, or just old information. So, but it's really kind of detrimental when it comes to public health practice, because it can drain resources, both human and financials, for communicators that have to now communicate around this misinformation. When people are misinformed, they may make decisions that are not in the best interest of their health. I mean, that could cause harm or even death in some cases. And that we have to know too that trusted channels of information go way beyond social media when it comes to managing misinformation. So it's like, and all forces, all channels must be on to kind of address misinformation. And that can come from several different things. We know that there's sometimes fake experts out there. Can be some logical fallacies, some misinterpretation of science, impossible expectations. One right now in vaccine is that people think, oh, I've gotten vaccinated, that's it. There's no threat to me for COVID-19, but that's not the case. There's no vaccine that's 100% effective. And then cherry picking data and facts that make up a falsehood as well. And then of course, there's the conspiracy theorists as well. Next slide. And then, we can cut misinformation down to a couple different factors. Misinformation can just be, like I said, accidental falsehoods or wrong or misleading information. It can be old information, whereas disinformation is purposeful. It's deliberately engineered falsehoods that get sent around with the intent to cause harm. And then there's just rumors, which is unverified information. And it's important to know that sometimes rumors can be true. They're not all false. So what you might be able to do with your communities is to consider debunking myths and rumors. We'll talk about that. Point people to trusted sources of information, and then do what we call pre-bunking or social inoculation, where you prepare people that there probably is going to be false information about this particular topic, and most definitely around vaccines. So when you're talking with your communities, you can say, listen, you may hear some misinformation or some falsehoods about vaccine. They may be kind of like this, this, and this, but the truth really is, and then you fill in that information. I'll talk about how to do that, I think, in my next slide, please. Yeah, so this was some of the early work that WHO was doing around myth busting. I mean, if there was one thing in the top of 2020 that was occurring, there was a lot of myths and misunderstandings out there because we just didn't know a lot in the beginning. So what WHO did was start to create social media tiles that stated what the misinformation was and try to give some truthful information afterwards. But now what we found, we learned from our earlier lessons, that what we have to do is create a truth sandwich where we essentially state the fact, give a warning that you may hear some misinformation, lightly touch on the fallacy, and then end with the fact again. People always remember the first thing they heard and the last thing they heard. So it's important to not lead with the misinformation or end with the misinformation, because that's the point that people carry over in their memory. Next slide. And then just to say too, it's important to realize how and why people are sharing misinformation. And this title is called "The Truth May Be Irrelevant in Sharing Misinformation," because people tend to share information to express their feelings. It's a way to cope with uncertainty, to create sort of a social cohesion. And so there's many different reasons that people do it, and they're probably moving forward with information because of those emotions, less so thinking, wait a minute, is this true? Could I cause harm by sharing this information? So it's just important to understand the emotion behind if people are sharing misinformation, particularly through social media. Next slide. And this is something where we've seen too with the politicization of scientific facts, that it's difficult to have the conversation with individuals who have opposing worldviews. Some of the things that we do know is that it's important that we don't directly refute misinformation that somebody is sharing with us. It's important to kind of find that common ground and common understanding or common interest behind the issue at hand. And it may be in the case of vaccines, well, well, what would vaccines give us? What are the benefits? Oh, well, we all want to be able to visit our family, right? You feel one way about vaccines, I feel a different way, but maybe the commonality is that we both want to visit our families again. Okay, and then start there, and that helps build a better line of communication because you've started with this common ground. And so we can see some more information there about what it's like when you have to communicate with individuals and with opposing views. And next slide. Great. So just some tips for building trust. You'll probably hear us reiterate some of these things. It's okay to accept and communicate uncertainty. This is one thing that we even try to do from WHO. We try to explain what we know and what we don't know. It's important that you just admit when you don't know the answer rather than making something up. You can say, listen, we just don't know this, or it may not be that you don't know it. Science may not know it at the time. Important to share information in a timely, proactive way and be transparent about potential risks. And that would be the case of openly talking about side effects for vaccines. And it's important to respect and acknowledge some diversity of opinions, use clear and simple language, use the language of the individuals that you're communicating with, and then don't be over reassuring. I know that can be sometimes something that individuals and spokespeople feel like they should do to kind of calm people down, but it comes off as very paternalistic, and oftentimes individuals don't trust that sort of line of it'll be okay, everything's under control. They know it's not under control, so that's something we advise not to do. Okay, I think that's it for this section. I think we were maybe going to go on to some question and answers if there's time.
I'm indeed. Yes, perfect. Thank you. So just colleagues if you have questions, please definitely write them into the Q&A box so we can ask our panel. But Mindy, just very quickly, we do have some questions. They're talking about, will the slides be shared, or will the information, especially the one on the trust that you presented, was very useful. Yeah, so that's
absolutely
going to be shared. Right? Perfect. Yeah. Okay, so that answers a couple of those. And we have another question, which is very relevant to what you were talking about, that if they do not trust some particular source already, it will be very hard to build that trust during the emergency, as you were saying, right? Yeah. So how do you think we can convince them to trust the good sources now?
Yeah. Well, I think it's what we've often tried to do is sort of figure this out ahead of time, right? Understand your audiences enough to know where they do seek trusted sources of information. And I think that that's why this network is particularly valuable, because you've created that trust prior to COVID-19, right? You had that trust going on with your communities ahead of time. I think what we try to do, another way to look at it is to have what we call third-party validation. So if you're communicating with your communities and saying, listen, here's a fact, it's important to get your vaccine when you can get your vaccine. You shouldn't maybe sort of be looking around for the most effective vaccine. Get your vaccine when it's given to you. And this is what the World Health Organization is saying right now. And this is why. So to provide a source of information that can be trusted, I use WHO in that example. There may be some more trusted organization within a country. It may be their Ministry of Health or their faith organization or whatever. But third-party validation, particularly of a scientific group, is important.
Mm-hmm. Great. And I would imagine that obviously, like the more that we speak with one voice to the audience, the better that trust building is, right?
Exactly. Like a lot of times what I'll say is that it's really critically important that we are all sort of using the same messaging, essentially. We don't all have to say the same exact thing, but we all better be singing literally as a choir, not as solo, sort of saying different thing. Because you'll often hear during emergencies that leaders may say, well, I don't want to say anything until I know everything, because my population will panic. And that's not so much the case. People know bad things happen, and they generally know that in the beginning, leaders or responders don't know everything. And so that's not what causes the panic. The panic or the concern among people is when they're getting too many sources of information that are saying different things. In the United States, where I come from, it's often you'll hear the leadership of the government saying something, a university expert saying another thing, or some sort of columnist or political the person sort of saying something completely different, and that's when it causes concern and confusion.
Right. Perfect. So just like that alignment and that coherence, from all of us. Consistency is very important.
Yeah.
There's another question about what about the role of language, literacy, gender, and culture when it comes to risk communications? What are your thoughts on that?
Critically important. And I'm glad that somebody asked that question. And this is a tough thing, period, anyway, during any circumstance, but particularly now when so much of our communications really is heavily laden with terminology and specific facts. And it's hard to kind of simplify those to a point. Sometimes this is what my team does all the time and struggles with a bit, is to simplify things enough to make it meaningful, while including all the very different nuances. And this is not so easy. So again, trying to use the terminology that individuals use. At WHO, we're trying to do a lot more message testings to make sure that the things that we're saying are giving actionable guidance and that people will know what to do based on that. Gender has another specific role too, because what we're finding is that that male and female populations are actually having different levels of vaccine. So this is coming more and more into play. And it could be the issues of the blood clots might be more an issue among young females, and so on. So our communications really has to be able to adapt to address specific questions for these individuals, young, old, those who put on the prioritization for vaccines and individuals who aren't. Everything sort of requires a slightly different message.
Thank you, Mindy. The questions are coming. So thank you, colleagues. This is really great. Another question we have is, what are some of the tools we can use to depoliticize public health issues in a crisis, which is so critical? Mindy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this group is probably well to depoliticize things. I think that you're working in an area that's hopefully outside of the government system that can allow you to have a freer discourse of communication, and allow you to have that conversation. I think what we're finding too around this area of work is that things can become quickly politicized when, particularly in short form social media. So the short forms of social media where you're just looking at a tile that has one statement, people can quickly react to that and react sort of different ways. What is a good idea is to sort of steer individuals to longer forms of communication, either something on YouTube where there's a little bit of a more discourse and there's more space to give the arguments or the reasoning behind certain facts. That's one thing we're finding. And also, again, just reverting back to this group that's probably able to have that longer conversation, answering people's questions, ensuring that they have the space to ask those open questions in a very respectful area. So I think those are some of the things that can really help with this issue.
I'm going to ask, thank you, Mindy. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then colleagues, please continue to put your questions into the chat box. We'll move over to this next part of the presentation, and we'll come back to these questions, and we'll have both the panelists, respond to you. But one question, and I know that at UNICEF, this was something for our comm strategies, for the global prioritization and everything, we really had to struggle in terms of the sheer volume of people who asked this question, and that was, why is it mandatory to get vaccinated? Right? What if someone doesn't want to be vaccinated? So can we respond to that? Because that's a question that's coming from the group as well.
Well, I think if people are questioning getting vaccinated, I think that maybe it might help to think beyond themselves, right? If you're questioning you need it or you're not worried about your own health, okay, stop for a moment and then think about all the people around this individual that may be more vulnerable, older individuals, healthcare workers, people that we really need now more than ever to be saving lives. So I mean, I think thinking beyond yourselves. I think also we do have recent research that's showing that people are doing that more than we thought, that becomes that decision point, that tipping point that help people to choose to get a vaccine. They thought about the other lives that they could be helping by protecting themselves, so therefore not kind of carrying on the virus as much. So I think those are pretty critical points. The other thing that we're really trying to do more in our communication is not just be so top-down approach and directive with our communication, go get a vaccine, but rather showing the benefits to getting vaccine. If you get vaccinated, you may be able to travel again. We may be able to get to the situation where you can visit your family members again, or do other activities that you used to be able to do. So to really focus on the benefits of vaccine. My colleague Leilia might have some other answers around that as well.
That's a really great segue, because I feel, Lily, we're going to just pause from the Q&A. Mindy, thank you so much. But just being very conscious of time, we will come back to you, Mindy, because there are a lot more questions coming through. But Lilia, may I hand over to you for your part of the presentation on how to have conversations about the COVID-19 vaccine, and then we'll move on to the other Q&A session and address them to both of you. Lilia, over to you.
Of course. And it's so great to see these questions coming through. So please do keep them coming, and we'll try and make sure there's lots more time at the end to go through them. So moving on from all of what Mindy has been talking about, which is also valuable, we wanted to go into a little bit more practical detail about some of the conversations you might need to be having, some of the questions you might need to be asking. So these following few slides are some tips about when you're having conversations about COVID-19 vaccines. And the great thing is that a lot of these tips are applicable much more broadly. So a lot of the research that went into these stages comes from conversation with parents about childhood vaccines and so on. So if you could just go to the next slide. So the first thing that's the most important when you're having conversations with people is to be empathetic. It's such a natural response when you hear that somebody saying that they're not sure that they want to get a vaccine that you think is so critical and important and life-changing, to be like, what? How can you possibly think that? This is all the information. You must go ahead and get vaccinated. But it's so much more valuable and more impactful if you can hold back your original impulses and listen with empathy to people's concerns and acknowledge how they're feeling. So just repeat it back to them, like, I'm hearing you saying that you're feeling really worried. Shall we talk about it further? Next slide, please. So once you've expressed your empathy and made yourself into somebody safe to have these conversations with, somebody who is non-judgmental and is there to listen, you can then try and find out a lot more about where the individual or the group's feelings of doubt or concern might be coming from. And the best way is to do that through open-ended questions. So could you tell me more about why you feel that way, for example? Next slide, please. And that just really opens up the space for people to express their own concerns. And that gives you really important information that you'll need to be able to shape the answers that you give or the information that you share. So the third step is about sharing the trusted information. But the really important thing is you shouldn't share information without asking. So say to the person that you're talking to, would you like me to share some information with you that I found helpful when I was thinking about these exact same kind of questions? So you can offer to help find that information and direct them towards trusted sources, but it should never be an assumption that person wants to know what you're thinking. Because if someone is asking and open to receiving information, then they're going to be much more likely to actually absorb it and potentially change their beliefs or their behavior. Next slide, please. And finally, I think this came up in the Q&A, but really dive into the reasons, the positive reasons to get vaccinated. So, here you've got somebody who wants to be able to see their grandparents again, or someone who wants to feel safe if they have to go back to the office. And you can I think what's really valuable is if you really spend some time reflecting on what your motivation is to be vaccinated. For me personally, that would be not having to worry that I'm going to infect myself, and hopefully be able to help protect those people around me, even though we don't really have the data to know the extent to which that's possible yet. I'd like to be able to travel again. And so on. So really try and tap into those, and then you can have really engaging conversations with people about what their motivation is too, and try and make the positives outweigh the negatives. Next slide, please. And I'm just going to pass back to Mindy quickly to run through the next few slides.
Yeah, we'll just go through these next slides pretty quickly. This is a flow of conversation. It's really meant for healthcare workers who are working with individuals coming in for a vaccine. So it's how to have that conversation. Two things I thought might be useful for this group, because I know there are healthcare providers within faith organizations that might find this interesting, but there are also a couple tips that you can take on throughout the conversation about a vaccine. So the first thing to think about is listen for the kinds of questions or concerns an individual has. Are they talking about the safety issues? Are they confused about priority groups? Why does somebody get it, but I don't get it? Are they shopping around vaccine? I want the most effective one. Again, just what Leilia was saying in terms of using respectful language and being empathetic, and so on. Let's go to the next slide, please, Alex. And this just breaks the conversation into threes. And the first thing that happens, and is shown to create quite a positive, next slide, please, uptake of vaccine, is when a healthcare worker initially meets a patient, they say something positive like, "Oh, I see you're here to get your vaccine." So a more declarative, yet positive statement, and people tend to go ahead and get their vaccine, versus a more questioning line, something like, "Well, do you think you want to get your vaccine?" Because that kind of causes some questioning in people's minds. So we find that just even the positive presumption of that in a again toned positively often works. So and then if people you can just move on to open up the conversation, just like what Leilia was saying in terms of keep open-ended questions and moving through the conversation. Next slide. And then the next phase is really that, again, that you use empathy in the line of questioning, provide more information, again, like what Leilia said, to offer it. Ask first and then offer it. Try to understand if people are concerned, confused, angry about something, understand where they're at and try to get to that common ground before the conversation continues. And then next slide, I think this is the last one for this area, is that basically then when you've asked the individual if they're going to continue to go ahead and get the vaccine after they've had a number of questions, they'll move yes through the vaccination process. Always important to remind them that even if they've been vaccinated, they should follow public health and social measures, because we still don't know enough about whether or not people, whether vaccinated or not, can still carry on the virus and spread it to others. If they choose not to vaccinate, the important thing here is to listen to them respectfully, but try to keep the communication channel going so they know they can come back to you for trusted information and maybe change their mind for a vaccine later. Next slide. And this is just some tips that will send you the slide presentation, and then you'll get just some common pitfalls in communication that can make people pause a minute, that direct the conversation in the wrong direction, versus some more effective means of communication. Speaking as an equal, be very transparent about what you know and what you don't know. Try to match your messaging with the listener, and then so on. And then next slide, I think we go back to Leilia.
Yes, so I think what we've gone through there is kind of a range of the different levels of conversations that you might be having as faith leaders. So many of you will be having these conversations on an individual level, which are the kind of slides that I went through. And then many of you will also probably be delivering health services and having the more technical conversations like what Mindy was going through. But there's also a lot of other things that I think faith leaders are really individually and uniquely positioned to do to really help boost vaccine confidence. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So the first thing is leading by example. So be very open in the support that you feel towards vaccination. Build this positive social norm around vaccination. Share your personal experiences. Share things that you believe support vaccination from the tenements of your religious background, for example. Build an enabling environment in which the people who respect and trust you will feel that there is a general positive association with vaccination. And then, of course, the second point here is, even though you're creating that positive background, you also want to make your community a really safe space for people to come with questions. So one thing that you could do is run question and answer sessions where people can come, you give them some background around the vaccine, and you allow them to ask the questions that they have, and you answer whichever ones you can. We actually have tools that we might be able to share with you to help facilitate those sessions, including question and answer documents that go into detail on some of the things that may come up the most. And this is the point we've been hammering home. Those answers coming from somebody trusted like you is so much more valuable than that information sitting on a web page on the WHO website. You may be getting your information from these technical sources, but it's your expression and your view of the world that's going to make that so engaging. And thirdly, there's a real dialogue at the moment about vaccine hesitancy and people not wanting the vaccine because of their own individual doubts. But what we actually see in a huge number of cases, that it isn't vaccine hesitancy that's stopping people from being vaccinated, it's barriers to vaccination, wrongly qualified as hesitancy. So there's a lot of things that you can do to help make vaccination much more convenient for people. Faith leaders have an awful lot of power and influence and positive sway in their communities. So you can do things like set up a fund for childcare or travel costs to help people get to vaccination appointments, advocate with local businesses to actually make sure that employees are given paid time off to go to their vaccination appointments, and just try and understand what the barriers are within your communities, and then come up with ways to make it easier for people to go to their appointments, such as organising transport or whatever it is that helps to overcome the barriers that you are seeing locally. Next slide, please. And this is something really critical, which I feel like as WHO, we're always hammering home. But I think, honestly, this is one of the most important things that can be done within the vaccine communication space, is while we need to reinforce the messages that vaccines are safe and effective and important, we need people to understand that they are not the silver bullet. They are not going to end this pandemic as soon as you individually are vaccinated. The most important things that we can all do to be controlling this pandemic are the things that we have been saying since the beginning. And we are all sick to the back teeth of hearing these things. You've got to physically distance, wear a mask, keep your rooms well ventilated, stay away from crowds, clean your hands and cough into your elbow or a tissue. This is not exciting to say. That nobody really wants to be hearing this stuff. What you want to hear is that once you're vaccinated, you're free to go and live life how you were living it before. So any way that you as a community feel that you can try and communicate these pieces to your communities in a powerful way, I mean, please tell us if you find the way forward here. Next slide, please. So as WHO, we try to develop information in a hierarchy. So we try to have the very simple key messages for people who don't want to know the details, but they just want to know what they need to do. Then we try and provide these simple explainers, which provide a little bit more information for people who are a bit more interested, and then in-depth explanations that may be a bit inaccessible to everybody, but some people can really dive into when they want information. And one of the things this is something that I think is useful for all of you as well. When you're talking to your communities, try to really think about where the information they need would fall on this hierarchy, and make sure that you are well versed enough in the science and in the data to make sure that you can really provide the targeted level of information. So if you could skip to the next slide, please, Alex. And the next one. What we've done in the next few slides, and this is just the last piece of our presentation, is gone through some of the key questions that we assume you might have within your communities. And what I wanted to do was show you how we try to have this key message, the simple explainers, and the in-depth information to make it easier for you as you go and look for this information and the members of your communities on our websites. So for example, a question that comes up a lot is, do vaccines contain pork products? Are they halal? So we would have a very clear and simple message. Yes, they are halal. They do not contain pork or animal products of any kind. And that's the main thing that everyone needs to know. But then we would have infographics that go into more detail. And, you know, when I was trying to piece these slides together, I noticed that we don't have an in-depth explanation on this. And I'd love to hear from you all in the chat box. Is this something you're asked a lot? Is the key message enough? Do we need to prepare more? Next slide, please. So another question that, of course, you probably all have this question. I have this question. Everyone is asking this. Will vaccines cause blood clots? As you can see, our key messages are not always that short and snappy. We've got a few lines here, but some issues are just too complicated. So a very rare but serious side effect, which is the blood clotting, has been reported in a very small number of people after their first dose of 2 of the vaccines. The benefits of vaccination are far greater than the risk of this rare side effect. And the blood clots are actually more commonly caused by the virus than by the vaccine. Millions of the doses have been administered with very few side effects. So the key thing there is that we're not saying that there is no risk. The risk is there and it exists, and we want to be honest about it. But we want people to understand that the benefits greatly outweigh the risk. So we're developing social media tiles on this. And then for in-depth explanations, you can see we have these very dense statements, which are inaccessible to most people unless they really want a lot of technical information. But hopefully those social media tiles will provide the bridge. Next slide, please. Which vaccine is most effective? This is one that luckily we can answer really snappily. Basically, the answer is all the vaccines are great. When it's your turn to be vaccinated, just take the one you're offered. It's more important to be vaccinated quickly than to split hairs about exactly which vaccine you'd like to receive. So I've listed there the different products that we have that can help you explain that sort of answer. Next slide, please. What effect will variants like the Delta variant have on vaccines? Now, this is a really important question where one of the real basic principles of risk communication comes into play, which is admitting when you have uncertainty, when you don't know all of the answers. This is something that we are discussing on a regular basis within WHO. But what we do know, the data that we do have now, tells us that the vaccines do protect against disease and hospitalization and death from the Delta variant. So get vaccinated as soon as you can and make sure you keep going with the protective behaviors. And what we're still trying to find out is, to what extent is that protection provided? Is it the same as the other variants? And one of the questions I saw in the chat was, how do you keep up with the rapid changes in the science, right? And this is a perfect example of this. We need to be able to communicate to people right now what we know about Delta and the vaccines, but we also need to make people prepared to know that this information may change, is likely to change. And the more people are aware that that change is coming, the more likely they are to accept that change in the future more easily with less resistance. Next slide, please. This is the final one, I think. Why do I still need to wear a mask after I've been vaccinated? We all want to know the answer to this question, right? And this is one of those political ones that, as we talked about earlier in the chat, in the Q&A, so that we know that the vaccine is very effective against severe symptoms and death, but we don't know, it's another thing we don't know, to what extent being vaccinated stops you picking up the virus and passing it on to somebody else. So the best thing you can do to protect both yourself and other people is get vaccinated, but also keep going with the key protective behaviors, including wearing a mask. So next slide, please. I think that's actually my last slide. Yes. So now we're back to the Q&A. So B, over to you to go through the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was a really, really, really great presentation. So thank you. We did get a couple of questions coming in. Let me just. Okay, so one question that we had was, how do we meet the different information needs of different age groups? How do we engage them, and how do we build trust across the different age groups? And I know that, for example, in UNICEF, like we're very, very cognizant of the needs of the different age groups. And so, I think like messages are usually tailored for them. So it's the same information, but the how it is presented differs, right? But please, over to both of you for your responses.
Sure. I think this is something that's been really interesting over the last year and a half, right? When COVID hit, we had some basic information that we had to get out for everybody, what this virus is and what do you do to protect yourself. And then as we've seen time go on, we've noticed really different situations for different age groups, like very different risk profiles, very different needs, different ways that you need to protect yourself, and now very different access to the vaccine, right? So we do have to make sure that we're targeting this information very specifically. So I think the important thing comes twofold. One, really understand the science and what each age group needs to know. And then also understand each age group. What questions are they asking? What are their worries? How do they best access information and process it in a way that they can trust? And who the different age groups trust is going to be vastly different. So try and get those two pieces of data and slot them together to inform what you choose to do. Mindy, anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that was great. Thanks.
Thank you. And so, Leilia, you did touch on this about the side effects, right? Like how you have to be honest and, let's give the facts, but then also let's contextualize the facts, right? That there might be side effects in terms of the larger percentage. It's a small amount, but this question keeps coming up. Like, how do you tackle the fear that people feel? Like when they get, if they get sick after a vaccination, but even just the fear of going in. So, and I know you've touched upon it, but perhaps given that this question keeps coming up, would you like to say something else?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the most important thing here is splitting the conversation. There's one conversation which is about the mild side effects that a lot of us will experience after vaccination. And then there's the more scary things that are coming up in the news and causing a big sensation. So the first topic on the mild side effects, it's about going back to that empathy messaging, right? None of us want to experience side effects after a vaccine. Parents have experienced how horrible it is to watch your baby crying in the hours after vaccination. We've all experienced what it's like to have a sore arm and a fever after getting one of our main vaccines. None of us want that to happen. But I think the really important thing there is emphasizing the negatives of feeling slightly under the weather for a few days is so okay compared to the real risk of the virus, and making sure, especially, there's been this real narrative that the virus is not dangerous for young people, and actually reminding them it is dangerous for young people. Maybe the risk is slightly lower, but you don't want to get sick, you don't want long COVID, and you don't want the risk of dying, and you don't want to pass it on to the people you love. So those side effects, yeah, we know we don't want them, but we'll survive them and we'll be okay. And then with the bigger risks, that's a much harder question to answer. Things like the blood clots with AstraZeneca, or some of the things we've seen with some of the other vaccines. And the real thing there is emphasizing how small that risk is. We're not saying that it's not scary, and we're not saying that it's not dangerous, but the risk of COVID is so much greater. And much better to try and protect yourself and take that step than to try and avoid a tiny risk and therefore expose yourself to a really big risk. Mindy, anything to add?
No, I think you put it perfectly. It is that sort of that description of comparison of risks, and that's not always that easy to do. It seems like we would be easily able to communicate that, but it's hard. It's hard for people to comprehend, because this is a decision they're making, and it's a decision they're making. It's their choice, right? And many people can accept almost the dangers that are out of their control, but this one is within their control. It's having to take the choice. So, but yeah, just what Leilia is saying, that it's a very, very small risk when it comes to these things. It's not that there's no risk; it's just very small in comparison to the very real risk of COVID-19. And another is to pull the conversation into yourself, right? Have conversations with people like you. Well, I understand your concern. I got my COVID-19 vaccine, and I was also concerned about the side effects. But you know what? My experience was positive, and this is, just to describe your experience.
Absolutely. And even saying my experience was negative, I was in bed for 3 days and I felt really grim, but I'm so grateful I got the vaccine, because I've just spent a year and a half being so worried about COVID, that honesty and being able to say, yeah, there was a negative side, and yet I still think this was incredibly worthwhile. That's a really powerful message.
Yeah. Great, thank you. And like all of this conversation was around the concept of trust, right? Like the what is trust and accurate information for trust, and then communicating that. But one of the panelists, one of the participants are asking, how do you assess which source is a trusted source, right? I mean, who gauges, and how do you gauge? How do you gauge influence? I think that would also be an interesting one. What would you say to that? And it's either to either one of you or to both of you.
Well, ideally, it's good to know your audiences ahead of time. We as communications professionals try to look at that ahead of time to really gauge what sources of information people trust. Generally speaking, what we've seen is that people are reverting back to kind of more traditional forms of communication, like mass media, newspaper, television, radio shows. But every community is very different. So it's just important to know your audience where that's concerned. Typically, people are saying that they don't tend to trust everything they read on social media. But again, these are generalizations. And that whole area of how to best measure and evaluate trust is a new area. I just actually released an article called The Science of Trust, and how are we going to measure this in the future. Leilia, I'm sure you have something to jump in with here.
I guess I would just say, as WHO and as organizations who consider ourselves like intelligent and we've got the best interests of our populations at heart, we're always going to say, trust us, right? We are trustworthy. Like in all our products, we say, go to the WHO website. That's where you can get your best information. And that's the best we can do, really, in terms of like determining who is trustworthy. We think we're trustworthy, so we're trying to communicate that message. What we just have to remember is that everyone is saying that they're trustworthy. And the most important thing we can do is treat trust as our most precious commodity.
Absolutely.
Don't one of the things that often comes up is when there's a new piece of information or something is uncertain, there's this tendency to try and stay quiet on that because you don't want to say the wrong thing. But it's so much more impactful to say, hey, we don't know the answer to this yet. This is what we think now, and it's going to change, because that enables people to maintain their trust in you. Don't mess around with trust. And we've seen this so clearly over the pandemic. The countries where leaders have really been honest and clear and open, even with negative information, have seen much better epidemiological outcomes than the countries who said, it's fine, don't worry. So be honest.
Thank you so much. I'm very conscious of the time. So Leilia, any ending, like any last comments from your end? And then Mindy, I'll go to you, and then to Ben as well. So any last thoughts before we close? I believe we might.
Just
Mindy,
to say,
don't
underemphasize your role in this Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to say, as faith leaders, please don't underemphasize your role in this pandemic. Your trusted voice is absolutely critical. So please do stay engaged with WHO through this brilliant platform that Sarah and her team has established, and take your job seriously. Give yourself credit for the huge impact you're able to have. We're very lucky and grateful to have you all on board.
Thank you, Leilia. Mindy,
I couldn't have said that better myself. And just a special thank you for all the hard work you're doing to take this information, making it real for the communities that you're serving. We need you now more than ever, but we need also sort of a two-way relationship. We have a lot to learn from you too. You're on the ground. You see the misunderstandings people are having, or the questions they have and the concerns they have. So share that back so we can improve our work as well. So really, thank you. Thank you for your dedication and your time. We're not done with I wish I could say we are, but we're not. And so thank you again for working with us.
Thank you. And just to echo Mindy, I mean, you know, like whatever the comments you give us in these series of webinars are going back to this joint team of WHO, UNICEF, RFP. We're going to make sure that, like, you know, like these aspects are answered. So really, I mean, like your comments are extremely, extremely valuable. Ben, any last words from your end before we close? I'm not sure. I think he might be. Okay. Well, maybe Ben can come back in later, but just from my end, just a huge thank you to the panelists for a very, very, very interesting discussion and so much information. Thank you to all of you who've taken part in this, you know, who took the time out and who listened to what we had to say. You've continued to be a part of this series, and we're so grateful, and we really hope, you know, we continue to have you as part of this journey. You know, like we've talked about trust. There are going to be different aspects, you know, like each of the organizations are coming up with a lot of toolkits, communication products, how to engage with communications for development, for example. You know, from UNICEF's side, in partnership with WHO and with RFP, we just want to say that, you know, we are happy to provide whatever support you might need. Let us know what it is that would be helpful for you so that we can design this webinar as a response to the needs that are coming out. There are huge teams that work in all three of these organizations along with our partners, and we can help tailor, you know, like whatever it is that you need. So please do keep engaging with us, and we really hope to see more of you very, very soon. So thank you very much to all the participants, to all the panelists, to everyone who helped put all this this webinar together. It was such a pleasure, and we hope to see you soon. Take care, be safe. Bye-bye.